podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
What's good, boys and girls? Two Footed Podcast. Today is Wednesday. It is the 4th of September. I hope you're all well. Weather update. I genuinely don't know. It's raining 1 minute, it's sunny the next, and then it's raining again. At the moment, it's sunny. Few clouds. I'm expecting more rain. Today, we are going to carry on reviewing and rating the summer transfer windows of all 20 Premier League teams. Today we have Fulham, Ipswich, Leicester City and Liverpool. Those will take up parts 1 and 2. We'll get through them quickly. And then in part 3, it's time for some nostalgia. Recent nostalgia, though. We're not going too far back on this one. And the subject matter will probably surprise a few. But let's start with Fulham and their transfer window exploits. So, going out, João Palhinha, Tim Ream, Kevin Mbappé, and Jay Stansfield. They also lost Tosin Adarabioyo, Bobby De Cordova-Reid, Marek Roddick, Terence Conglo, which doesn't really make much difference, and Willian, who has signed for Olympiacos in the last couple of days. Nobody of note except Luke Harris being loaned out. He's gone to Birmingham, so he'll team up with Stansfield there. Those two know each other very well, and that should be good for Birmingham. Right, coming in on loan, Reiss Nelson, in from Arsenal. A talented winger, pacey, can play either side, but very inconsistent and almost 25 and still hasn't shown his ability on a regular basis. The best spell of his career was at Hoffenheim on a loan in 2018-19. The first half of that season, he was very, very good. Since then, he has been very frustrating. And Arsenal made a significant mistake last summer when they gave him a huge new contract on $100,000 a week for a player who had never played more than 17 times in a Premier League season for them, who had never played more than 23 times in all competitions for them, and had never really even been a regular on their bench, barring injury crisis. So Arsenal were looking to move him on. He was looking to move on and go and play, and credit to him. And I think this is a decent pickup for Fulham. There's no obligation to buy or anything like that. There's no long-term commitment here. If he does well, they'll have the opportunity to buy him. If he doesn't, they'll just send him back. Simple as that, really. Permanent signings. Ryan Sessegnon on a free. He had left Tottenham after a fairly disappointing 5-year stay, where he also spent a year at Hoffenheim. Last season completely destroyed for him by injuries, never played more than 17 games in a league season, never played more than 23 in all competitions. Does this sound familiar? Like with Reiss Nelson, a very talented player who's just never shown a consistency, except for one season with Fulham in 17-18 in the Championship, when he scored 16 goals in 52 games. Now, he's largely playing as a left winger, but he also played left side of the midfield in that game, in that season. He can play left back, obviously, and we've seen him do that a lot in his career. He's never really had a manager trust him fully, is my take on it, since leaving Fulham, obviously. I think he was born to play as a wing-back, but not a lot of teams play with wing-backs. Now, when Antonio Conte was at Spurs, we saw quite a bit more of Sessegnon, and there was times when he did look like he was starting to grow into the player he promised to be. He's 24, he'll turn 25 in May. The next couple of years are make or break for him. He's never going to be the player that we hoped he would become, but he can still turn out to be a very good player. He's just going to need to perform consistently, and the key to that is going to be staying fit. Emile Smith-Rowe, another super talented young player, another 24-year-old, another who has never consistently shown the level that we know his talent can provide. He's done it more often than the other two, and he's done it at a higher level than the other two. And his 21-22 season was very, very good. I would put the last two seasons where he's played 14 and 19 games all competitions down to poor management from Mikel Arteta, because he was playing regularly before that. And then all we started to hear about was, his injury issues. He played 70 games between 2021 and 21-22. He did have a few muscle issues, no question, but Arteta failed him. And I'm hopeful that at Fulham, he'll find a home and excel. They signed Jorge Cuenca, a young Spanish centre-back. Young, 24 years of age. Actually will turn 25 later this year. He's older than I thought. He'd been at Barcelona for a number of years, was quite highly regarded, never got the breakthrough in the first team, went to Villarreal, had a couple of loans from there, and then established himself last season and was very good. Little bit surprised that Fulham have gotten him at the price they've gotten him at, but I think that's a good move for all involved. He did well at Almeria, did well at Getafe, he's done well at Villarreal, he's a tough physical defender. I think he'll do quite well there. He can also cover left back, which might give them a different look if they need it. They bring in Sander Berge. Now that's obviously the signing to replace João Palhinha, slightly different type of player obviously, but big, powerful, rangy, defensive midfielder. He wouldn't have still been playing at the Sheffield Uniteds and Burnleys of the world if not for that horrible ankle injury he suffered in his first season with Sheffield United. When he was at Genk, he was looked at by everybody. All the top clubs were showing interest. I'm still not sure how Sheffield United managed to get him, but they did. He comes in, he does pretty well, then he gets hurt. And he's never quite been the same. But he was outstanding for them in their championship promotion season. Burnley last season, I don't know what to make of that team. I just point at company and go, what does that fella do as a manager? I really don't know. For the money they've paid at 20 million, I think it's a good deal for Fulham. Is he as good as Palhinha? No. But he's also 3 years younger than Palhinha. And 3 years ago, people weren't looking at João Palhinha as a top-class player. People were looking at him and wondering, can he perform outside of Portugal? He'd done well for a season. You know, you look at his time, João Palhinha's time with Sporting, his first season showing what he could do at a decent level for them was 2021. He'd had the loan at Braga and done okay, but Sporting is a step up. And that's 2021. João Palhinha was 25 beginning that season. Sander Berge is the same age now as Palhinha was at the end of that season. Sander has a chance, if he can stay fit, to become a very, very good player over the next couple of years. And then they bring in Joachim Andersen, which is a really good signing. Now, I said yesterday, I think it's a really good sale for Crystal Palace. I also think it's a really good signing for Fulham, because they needed a leader in defence. They needed an aerially dominant player in defence. And at 6'4", that's what he offers. He is powerful in the air. He's a good 1v1 defender. He's a good passer of the ball. I like him. I do like him. I think he's a good player. 28 years of age. He's older than the others they've brought in, but he brings experience and leadership to a team that's sorely lacking it. And I think you've got him and Bassi is an option, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's him and Cuenca at some point during the season, and that's what they stick with. Because I think that gives them a stronger base than Bassi does, because the issue with Bassi will always be the variance in position, in performance. Bassi is a better player than Cuenca. And Bassi's best games are better than Cuenca's best games, but Bassi's bad games are as bad as anybody in the league. Like, he can genuinely be atrocious at times. So it wouldn't surprise me if at some point in the next 4 months we see Calvin Bassi lose his place and Kuwait could take it on next to Anderson. I would have liked another wide player. I know they got in Reece Nelson, but I would have liked another one because they lost two. For me, Smith Rowe was much better in central areas. I think that's where he can really influence games. Now, it depends on how they want to line up, but I do think him as a 10 is the most natural fit. I would have also liked one more in midfield. I'm really surprised they didn't push on with that Andre deal when they had it on the table, but they made the decision not to. All in all, they've had a good window. They've come out with a net spend of around 15, 20 million. I think they're improved on the whole from what they were last season. I think Anderson, I would take him over Tosin. You would take João Palhinha for sure over Sander Berge, but I don't think the gap is necessarily as big as an all-round player as people make it out to be. I think Smith Rowe, Kawanka, Sessegnon and Nelson, they add to the team. And Nelson's definitely better. No, Nelson's more talented than Di Cordova-Reid. Is he better? We'll see. He can be, for sure. He can be, for sure. And if they get Sessegnon back on track, that could be a hell of a pickup. It's a big ask, but we'll see. All in all, I'll give them a B+. I think it's a good window. It's a solid window. Could maybe have done a little more. Ipswich Town, Omari Hutchinson, Ben Johnson, Jacob Greaves, Liam Delap, Arna Murridge, Connor Townsend, Sammy Smodics, Jack Clark, Dara O'Shea, Chidozie Ogbonna coming in. Whole bunch of players left. Nobody of note. Nobody that was Premier League proven and Premier League ready. They've loaned in Calvin Phillips and Jens Gehust. They're excellent signings for them. They've loaned out George Edmondson. They've loaned out Cameron Humphreys and Marcus Harness. Edmondson, I thought, might play a bit more of a role because he's been quite important for them. But they're much stronger defensively now because they've brought in Greaves, they've brought in O'Shea, they've brought in Ben Johnson, and you've got Twanzebe can play centre-back as well. So there isn't really minutes to be found for Edmondson. So it makes sense. All things considered, I think they've had a really good window. Now, I love how ambitious they've been. I love the fact they've gone out and they've not been afraid to spend money. Because we've seen their local rivals, Norwich, come up multiple times, do nothing, go straight back down, bank the money, come back up, do nothing, and go straight back down again. Last year, we saw Luton take the approach of, let's just try and build a good championship team, go down, and then be in a strong position to come back up, and maybe the second time around, we'll have a crack. Not really working out all that well for Luton so far this season. Hutchinson was vital to keep because he'd been so important for them last year. Greaves was the best centre-back in the championship. It made sense. Delap is a good all-round 9. It made sense. Smodics was the best player in the championship last year. Jack Clark, one of the best wide players. Remember, they also almost signed Jaden Philogene. They missed out on him. They pivoted to Clark about a month later and get Clark across the line. I love the signing of Dara O'Shea. I think him and Greaves potentially is a really good pairing. Ogbonna can play both wings. He can play as a wing back. He brings versatility. He brings pace. He's a really hard worker. He's relentless in his pressing. I really like the business they've done. I really do like the business that they've done. They spent a lot. There's no question. 18 million on Hutchinson, 15 on Greaves, 15 on Delap, 8 on Murridge, 9 on Smodics is a bargain, by the way, 15 on Clark, 12 on O'Shea, and 8 on Ogbonna. That's really good value. There's not one of them that you'd look at and think, oh, that's an overpay. Murridge is the only one I'm not really keen on because I just think he's too error prone. He's the one I wouldn't have gone for. And considering Wolves bought Sam Johnston for 10 million, Sam Johnston would have been a much better signing. He might not be as talented as Muric, but he's far more reliable. That's the one thing I ding them on, is the Muric deal. But if I look at an Ipswich team that has Muric in goal, Johnson, O'Shea, Greaves, and Davis as a back four, Phillips and Cahoust as a double pivot, Hutchinson, Smodics, and Clark as a three, and then Delap, that's a really strong team. Now, it's going to take time to knit together. And obviously, Leif Davies is the only player there who was in the team all of last season, because Mari Hutchinson came in the January. It's a lot of change. It's a lot of change. So it'll have to be done gradually. And it's unfair on a couple of players. Like, I would say the obvious one there is probably Luke Wolfenden, who's been vital to them. He's come to their academy. He's a homegrown player. But I do think O'Shea is a better defender than him. Now, it may well be that what we see is that they go back to the back three. So they might go O'Shea, Wolfenden, and Greaves. That might give them more solidity. Then they could go maybe Ogbena as a wing-back, Davis as a wing-back, Phillips and Cahoust in the midfield, and then you've got options. You're going to play Liam Delap as your 9, and then Al Hamadi as the backup. In the two behind, you've now got 4 really good options. You've got Amari Hutchinson, Jack Clark, Sammy Smodics, and Connor Chaplin, who I do think is a good player. So you've got 4 good options there. You've also still got Nathan Broadhead as well, who's a decent player. So it's a pretty strong group. I do wonder if we might see a move to the back 3. It'll mean one of the big money summer signings isn't a regular starter, but it'll mean you can rotate them, keep them fresh, and hopefully pick up enough points to stay up. The only 2 things they didn't address, they were looking for another striker. We all know that. They tried to get Armando Broja in. It didn't work out for them. They tried to get Lyle Foster in. Couldn't get that deal done. They tried to get Odson Edouard in. Couldn't get that deal done. I'm not then sure how it is he ended up going to Leicester, but I appreciated the fact that they were being as ambitious as they were, as aggressive in the market as they were, trying to get deals done. And they just came up short. The other thing was I would have liked another left back, but I kind of understand that Connor Townsend was signed to be the backup left back. So fair enough. You know, Davis is undeniably the starter there, but, you know, Premier League's a big step up. It may be that he struggles. So I would have liked maybe a different option there as the left back, but Connor Townsend is a solid player. He won't let you down. All things considered, they've had an A window. They've had an A window. It would have been an A plus if they signed a different goalkeeper. If they got Sam Johnston, I'd be sitting here saying it's an A plus window. You know, yes, they wanted a striker, and yes, I would have liked another left back, a different left back. But ultimately, you don't want to do too much. You don't want to bring in too many new players. They've already brought in quite a few. And I've seen people say, oh, you know, Forest a couple of years ago, Burnley last year, it's too much change. And that can be true, but I think they've been more balanced in what they've done. I think they've signed players with a higher floor. Like Burnley signed a lot of players with high ceilings, but not an established floor, not an established base performance level. I feel like with what Ipswich have brought in, a lot of them are proven at the high end of the championship. Hutchinson, Greaves, Delap, Smodics, they're all, and O'Bennett was, prior to Luton, was in the championship. They're all at minimum, really, really good championship players. Really, really good championship players. Ben Johnson's a proven operator in the Premier League. Dara O'Shea is a proven operator in the Premier League. Ogbena played well in the Premier League last season. My hope is that they do stay up, because I really don't want to see Dara O'Shea get relegated again. I really don't want to see him get relegated again, because I do like him as a player. I think he's good. I think he can bring leadership and organisation to that backline. I think Greaves brings a lot of that as well. I think Greaves is the one that has a chance to be very, very good. He'll turn 24 in a week, and a lot of people won't be familiar with him because he's been at Hull 4 seasons with Hull. I would argue he was the best centre-back in League One in 2020, which was his first season playing in that league. He'd been on loan at Cheltenham the year before and was excellent for them in League Two. Stepped up to League One, no issue. Stepped up to the Championship, no issue. The last 2 years, I'd say quite clearly the best centre-back in the Championship. It's a surprise that it took this long for him to get a move. But I think Ipswich have done brilliantly, especially at that price. I think him and O'Shea, potentially, very, very good centre-back pairing. Very, very strong. Honest defenders as well. Not lads that are going to be flopping around or trying to cheat their way out of things or running away from the defensive work. It's an A window for Ipswich Town, and I'll be back after the break.
When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and brilliant marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does selling better than Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret? With Shop Pay that boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going. So if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell whatever your customers are scrolling or strolling on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Skims uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/try to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/try.
Right, welcome back. So, Leicester City up next, and they've had a pretty busy window, to be fair. Going out the door, Mark Albrighton, who's decided to retire. Best of luck in whatever he does. I assume he'll become a pundit. He's always talked quite well about the game, so I assume he'll pop up as a pundit somewhere. Maybe he goes into coaching, who knows. Kelechi Iheanacho leaves on a free. Kieran Dewsbury-Hall goes to Chelsea. And they loaned out quite a few players. Silko Thomas, Harry Suter, Tom Cannon, Wanya Markal. Yeah, nobody that was really going to make much of an impact. Coming in, the 2 loans I like. Facundo Buenanote is very, very talented. He didn't really fit all that well at Brighton because he's probably naturally a 10. Brighton were using him off the right because I think they bought him with the idea of he'll be our Solly March successor. And he potentially could have fit there, but you look now at what they've done this summer in terms of Minta, Gruda, and the other options they have in attack, and he was just kind of squeezed out. But very, very talented, and I'm looking forward to seeing what he can do with a bunch of games. I do kind of wonder where he's going to play when everybody's fitting up to speed. Because they've got Fatua on the right, he has to play. And they've just brought in Bilal El Khanas, whose natural position is also that number 10 position. But maybe Khanas plays off the left, Buenanote central, and maybe they can move around during the game. I'm really interested. I think that's really exciting, but we'll come to that. Odsonne Edouard, they needed a striker. I don't think they had the money to get who they wanted. So Edouard's a decent player. We'll see how he does. They make the Fatua deal permanent. He's a big, big talent. Potentially a big, big star. Bobby D. Cordova-Reid on a free is clever business. Michael Golding from Chelsea, I don't know a whole lot about. He plays in midfield. We'll see what happens. Caleb Okoli, I like him. I think he can be a little bit rash at times, but I do like him. I think I think there's a world in which he's very quickly Leicester's best defender. Ollie Skip comes in. I think it's a bit of an overpay, but they did need some help in midfield. They did need some depth. And ultimately, he's a 23-year-old English player with Premier League experience. He's solid. He is solid. Like, he works hard. He's a good ball winner. He's a little bit of a ball chaser, but ultimately a decent player. So at 20 million, it's fine. I would not have paid 5 million for Jordan Ayew. I wouldn't have paid £5 for Jordan Ayew. If you were giving him to me on a free, fair enough, because he's versatile and can cover a bunch of positions and he works hard. But at this stage of his career, I just wouldn't have been paying money for him. Like, he turns 33 a week today. He's not a regular goal scorer. If we look at his career at Crystal Palace, 6 seasons there, 1 on loan, 5 as a permanent signing. 2 goals, 9 goals, 1 goal, 3 goals, 4 goals, and 4 goals. Do you know? Like, he's already scored for Leicester, and fair play, but I would be stunned if he scores more than 4 goals this season. Like I say, he works hard. He follows instruction, and he's versatile. It's not a bad squad addition, but I wouldn't have paid money for him. And then they get Bilal El Khanous. He is a supreme talent. An absolutely supreme talent. He needs to add goals to his game, but his creativity, his vision, outrageous. Looking forward to seeing how they use him and where they use him. I really do think Fatua, him, and Buonanotte together will be potentially very, very good. Behind them, you've got Harry Winks, you've got Ndidi, now you've got Ollie Skippin, you've still got Boubakary Soumare there as well. So you do have 4 good midfield options. They landed Casey McAteer a new contract, didn't they? Did he sign it? I want to say he signed a new contract in the summer. I could be wrong, but he's another really good young player, 22 years of age, showed quite a lot for Leicester last season, and I believe is soon to become an Irish international. So looking forward to seeing what he can offer. Golding, we'll see. I mean, he's only 18, so I don't know how much he'll play. And they've got Hamza Chowdhury still kicking about and still booting people up in the air, who's, a solid citizen. So they'll be hardworking. They'll be deep in midfield in terms of numbers. There's no real standout talent for the double pivot, but they'll be deep in terms of numbers. My concern is what happens if Vardy gets hurt. They've also got Mavididi, remember, as a wing option who's really, really good. My concern is what happens if Jamie Vardy gets hurt, because I don't know that I can rely on Patson Daka or Odsonne Edouard to get me the goals I need. But the biggest concern for me is at centre-back. They've got 2 good right-backs in Ricardo Pereira and James Justin. They've got 2 good left-backs in Victor Christiansen and Luke Thomas. Other than Akoli, I don't like the centre-backs. I don't like Vestergaard, I don't like Faze, and I don't like Conor Cody at the Premier League level. So that concerns me greatly. And I think the failure to address that, you have to hit them for it. In terms of what they did, I largely like it, but they didn't do enough. So they've got, for me, 2 big concerns. One up front, what happens if Vardy gets hurt, or if he has a bad season like he did the last time they were in the league. And what happens if Akoli gets hurt at centre-back, they're screwed. But if they have to continue to roll out Faze and Vestergaard, or Faze and Cody, or Cody and Vestergaard, they're going to be in a significant amount of bother. So I'll give them a B. I'll give them a B-. Liverpool, this will be quick. Going out, Thiago retired, Adrian was released, Matip was released, Musilowski was released, Frauendorf was released and Adam Lewis was released. They sold Anderson Arroyo and Billy Cometio for pennies. They got a really good fee for Fabio Carvalho, a good fee for Bobby Clark, a really good fee for Seth Vandenberg, and they also sold Harvey Blair. They loaned out Calvin Ramsey, Fabian Mrozic, Luke Chambers, Lewis Kumas, Lucas Stevenson, Reece Williams, Owen Beck, Callum Scanlon, Stefan Baccetic, Marcelo Pitaluga, Nathaniel Phillips, Ben Doak, and Cade Gordon. So a lot of players left the club in one way or another. A lot of players that last year were part of the first team picture. Last year, Luke Chambers played first-team football. Only a couple of games, and he had a loan back half the season. Lewis Kumas was involved in the first team. Owen Beck was on 2 different loans, either side of a very brief spell in the first-team picture. Callum Scanlon played around the first team, but was largely under 21. Baccetic missed most of last season, but was seen as a first-team player. Nat Phillips, I just don't know what to think of him anymore. Ben Doak and Cade Gordon were 2 players that Klopp had on his fast-track programme. It's a lot of players gone. Thiago, Adrian, and Matip as well. Now, Carvalho and Seth Vandenberg, they were not at the club last year. They were on loan. But Bobby Clark did play. He played a bit. So they've loaned out quite a lot. They've sold a few. They've released a bunch. Only one player coming in is Federico Chiesa. Now, they have also signed Georgi Mamardashvili. That deal is done. He will spend next season, or this season, with Valencia, and then he will join Liverpool next summer. Mamardashvili is a great signing for them. He's the best young goalkeeper in the world. He's the ideal successor to Alisson Becker. But Alisson's not going anywhere. Alisson might still have 4 or 5 years left in it. Now, Mamardashvili is probably not going to be overly chuffed if he gets loaned out for 4 or 5 years. But I do see the logic in him. I think, given the price, given the talent, given the potential that Alisson could turn around in 12 months and say, you know what, I'd like to move on. I love the deal. I love the signing of Chiesa. I absolutely adore the player. They got him for 10 million, potentially rising to 12.5. He's on good wages, not overly paid. He's versatile. He's hardworking. He's still only 26. He had a good year last year. Considering what had happened with a torn ACL and then the season that he had in 22-23 when he was just injured consistently because he was working his way back from the ACL. Based on that, it was a really good year. But in general, just a good season. I think he could potentially get back to what he was pre-injury. And what he was pre-injury was absolutely sensational. That might prove to be the bargain of the summer. However, Liverpool had 2 big needs going into the summer, and they didn't address either of them. They needed a defensive midfielder. They didn't go get it. They needed a new left back. They didn't go get it. That, to me, is a failure. Now, they've sold well. They've loaned well. And the 2 deals they got done are brilliant deals. But they didn't address their 2 big needs. So it's a C- from me. And I'll see you after the break. Right, welcome back. So, today's adventure back in time. Well, I had a couple of ideas I was bouncing around. And then I saw a picture of a footballer yesterday and I thought, you know what, I'd love to talk about that team. And I want to talk about the club because a lot of people look at this club and think, oh, they're just this club that once had a spell in the top flight and that's kind of all they've done historically. But when you look at their history, they've spent a lot of time in the top flight and they've produced some fantastic players. They've had some fantastic players. We think of them when the word agricultural is mentioned with regards to football, we often think of this club. I think it's probably for many people the first club that comes to mind. But through history, they played some good football. They had very talented players. And like I say, they spent a lot of their history in the top flight, and that is Stoke City, with the obvious subject of today being Stoke City in the Premier League under Tony Pulis. But let's get to that. Let's start with the great players that they've had. Now, there's three that stand out above all others, right? Three players who are among the greatest players England have ever had, whose careers had very meaningful stops at Stoke City. So the first one is Sir Stanley Matthews. He came through the Stoke Academy, joined them as a 15-year-old, made his debut at 17, and played for them for 15 years. Now, bear in mind, World War II took place in that time. So he was robbed of a significant chunk of his career. He left them at 32 to go to Blackpool. And people would have looked at it and thought, 32, he's probably got a couple of years left. You know, he's just going there basically to retire. He would play for Blackpool for 14 years, up until the age of 46, and then rejoin Stoke and play there for 4 more years. He won the first Ballon d'Or. He was 41 when he won the Ballon d'Or. The best European footballer of the year at 41. Ridiculous. But he was made in Stoke. He lived in Stoke. He played for Stoke. And it's often forgotten because he's so closely associated with Blackpool. Because many people think that's where he had the best spell of his career. I can't argue with them. I don't know if he did or he didn't. What I do know is he's one of the best players England ever had. There's three English goalkeepers that stand out above all others historically. One is Ray Clemence, and the other two played for Stoke. Gordon Banks played for Stoke from 1967 to 1973. Now, he'd come through at Chesterfield, he made his name with Leicester, and then he would move to Stoke. And he was still England number one. He was still probably the best goalkeeper in the league, or certainly in that conversation, when a horrible car accident in 1972 cost him his right eye and basically ended his professional career. He would move to America and play 2 seasons there, despite having sight only in one eye, was best goalkeeper both years. 73 caps for England, World Cup winner with England, made one of the greatest saves that anybody has ever seen from Pelé in 1970, missed the semi-final because he was unwell. England lost to West Germany and were denied the chance to retain the World Cup they'd won 4 years earlier. Gordon Banks was a phenom, an outrageously talented goalkeeper with reflexes that were freaky for that age, that time. You didn't see goalkeepers as agile as him back then. Most times the goalkeepers were the lads that weren't very good at football. They just got stuck in goal at a young age and they stayed there. He was actually a great goalkeeper. Him and Pat Jennings, probably the 2 best British goalkeepers of that era. You had Clemens came along afterwards, and then so did this guy, Peter Shilton. Now, Shilton was at Leicester, where he'd come through the academy, and he'd made quite the name for himself at Leicester. And having gone to Leicester once to find a goalkeeper, Stoke decided to do it again. So they bring in Peter Shilton, and he played there for 3 years before moving on to Forest, where he'd win 2 European Cups, etc., etc. Then Southampton, then Derby, and then his career kind of petered out and he became a bit of a journeyman and a bit of a backup. But Peter Shilton is undeniably one of the 3 best goalkeepers England ever had. He won 125 caps. When he retired, he was comfortably England's most capped player. An absolutely brilliant goalkeeper. Got into the Leicester team because Leicester had sold Banks on to Stoke. And then when Banks had to retire, a year after he had to retire, Stoke went and bought Shilton. To produce, arguably, now Ray Clemens, as I said, has a definite case to this, but to produce arguably the two best English goalkeepers, they didn't produce, admittedly, they didn't produce Banks, but they got Banks at like 21 and they developed him into the best goalkeeper in the country. And to then follow that up by having Peter Shilton come out of your academy or your YTS scheme as it was at the time, like, that's phenomenal. That is phenomenal. Like, let's just say, as an example, there's no great English goalkeeper now, so we might as well move away from England. Let's say, I mean, it wouldn't be Bayern. If Bayern were to produce the next great German goalkeeper, you wouldn't be surprised because they're Bayern. But for a club like Stoke, a mid-level, mid-table team, to have England's best goalkeeper, and then it'd be like Everton. Let's just say, even though he's not a great goalkeeper, let's just say Everton sold Pickford and introduced a 17-year-old into the first team who would go on to be, if not quite as good, very, very close. In some people's view, even better. Like, you don't hear of things like that happening anymore. But Stoke, or Leicester did it, and then Stoke had it, because Stoke had Banks and then Shilton. So those are the three greatest players to play for Stoke. They may not be the greatest Stoke players in terms of what they did for the club, but they were all great for the club. I would say, without question, Matthews would be viewed as the greatest Stoke player of all time. But you look at like Eric Steele's 597 games for them. John McHugh, 542. Bob McGrory, 511. Dennis Smith, 493. In terms of goal scorers, John Ritchie is their all-time leading scorer, 176. Freddie Steele, 159. Frank Bowyer, 149. And Charlie Wilson, 120. They've had quite a few England internationals, from Edward Johnson in 1884, George Shutt, Jimmy Sayer, Tommy Clare, Bill Rowley, Alf Underwood, Joe Schofield, Jimmy Turner, Tom Holford, Arthur Lockett, Arthur Capes, Stanley Matthews, Freddie Steele, Joe Johnson, Neil Franklin, Tony Allen, Gordon Banks, Mike Pejic, Alan Hudson, Peter Shilton, Dave Watson, who was a really good defender, probably best known for Sunderland, Man City, probably those two. But late in his career, went to Stoke, had a bit of a resurgence, got back in the England squad. Mark Chamberlain, who's the father of Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain, Ryan Shawcross, and then Jack Butland. And Jack Butland should have been the great English goalkeeper of this generation. Like, he should have been. Jack Butland at Birmingham, and then when he had the couple of loans and he went to Stoke, Jack Butland was so good. And then he shattered his ankle, and then he had an operation, and the operation was botched, and they had to redo the operation, and it cost him mobility in his ankle, and he was never the same. He's still a good goalkeeper, but he was a great, great goalkeeper in the making, and unfortunately just had that bad injury and the bad surgery, and it is what it is. Nobody capped since Butland. But again, 24 players, 142 caps won by Stoke City players. When I mentioned about their history, so they joined the Football League in 1888. They spent 2 seasons in it, get relegated to the Football Alliance, get promoted back to the Football League at the first attempt. The Football League is then rebranded as the First Division, and the Football Alliance is branded as the Second Division. They stay in the first division from 1892 all the way up until 1907. They get relegated. They immediately get relegated again and go into what we now call non-league, because there was no divisions 3 and 4, but those would come later. But they spent quite a few years then in non-league from 1908 all the way up until 1919, because no competitive football was played between 1915 and 1919. They do get promoted back into the second division, and they spend 3 years there. They get promoted back to the first division. They get relegated immediately back into the second division, 3 years, relegated to the third division, straight back up to the second division at the first attempt. And they're in the second division 1927 to 1933. They spend from 1933 all the way up until 1953 in the first division, but there was no football played between 1939 and 1946. And that's what I mentioned with Sir Stanley Matthews. He lost 7 years of his career. Now, there's very few players in history in English football who have been so highly regarded as Stanley Matthews. Very few. And certainly not many from his era. And he lost 7 years of his career. Ages 24 to 31. I've got that wrong. Hang on. Yeah, no, I'm right. 24 to 31. He lost his entire prime to the war. Every bit of it to the war. And he still went on and had the career he had. Anyway, they get relegated again in 1953. They're in the second division from 53 to 63, and they get promoted again. So from 63, they stay in the top flight till 1977. They get relegated. It's 2 years in the second division, and they're promoted again. They have 6 years in the top flight, and they get relegated. From 1985 to 1990, they're in the second division. They get relegated again into the third division. 2 seasons there. Then they're promoted into the second division, which became the first division at the launch of the Premier League. They get relegated into what we now call League One in 1998. They spent 4 seasons there. They get promoted back into what we call the Championship. And they stay in the Championship up until the 07-08 season. And in 07-08, Tony Pulis is the manager. He's in, I think, his 3rd season as manager. They'd finished 8th. Hang on a second. I've missed one. No, sorry, his 2nd season. He gets them promoted in his 2nd season. They finished 8th, and then they finished 2nd and got promoted. And the player who was the star of that show is the player whose picture I saw yesterday, who gave me the thought to do this. Ricardo Fuller, who was a really good striker for Stoke during his time there. And a player I always enjoyed watching. Proper journeyman. Never really found, other than Preston earlier in his career, never really found anywhere after Stoke where he had the same sort of impact. But he was powerful, he was big and strong, he was skillful, he could dribble, he had a great first touch, he scored some spectacular goals, and he just worked his arse off because that's what Tony Pulis demanded. So Stoke come into the Premier League in the 08-09 season. Now, they've been in the Britannia Stadium for a few years. It had been widely seen as by far the best stadium outside the Premier League. It was very, very impressive for a Championship club to have a stadium like that. So they had been prepared for the Premier League they'd been putting in the foundations to be a Premier League club, but for whatever reason, it just hadn't happened for them. They'd had some decent efforts at getting promoted, but ultimately they'd had as many relegations to League One, as promotions. So, Brian Little went there. He'd obviously done very well at Villa, but he went to Stoke. It didn't work. Gary Megson had been there. Gudjon Torderson was there. He didn't do very well. He did get them, I think, promoted back into the first division, didn't he? But either way, I mean, they were an afterthought. They were not a club that anybody was paying any attention to until Tony Pulis got there and brought them up into the Premier League. So in their first year, they signed Dave Kitson for $5.5 million, Sehi Olafinjana, don't remember him, for $3 million. Abdoulaye Faye comes in for $2.5 million. Andy Faye comes in on an undisclosed fee. I think it was like £1 million. Ibrahima Sonka comes in for $2 million. Danny Higginbottom for $2 million. Michael Tong comes in for $2 million. He was a really good player. Matty Edrington comes in for $2 million. And they signed James Beattie in the January. So coming up, spending for that time a significant amount of money for a newly promoted team. They loan in Henri Camara. Pulis seems to have a fascination at this point with Senegal because they've signed 4 Senegalese players. Stephen Kelly also comes in on loan. No notable departures other than John Parkin, who people will know if you listen to the Under the Kosh podcast. John Parkin is one of the main guys there. If you don't listen to it, I do recommend it. There's some absolutely belting episodes with guests on who talk. It's basically always the same formula. They bring on a guest, they talk about their careers, but they tell good stories. It's not like they bring on star names. It's a lot of like football's journeymen, lads that had good lower league careers, some that did it in the Premier League, but not on a consistent basis. There's some absolutely belting episodes there. So yeah, I do recommend that. And John Parkin is a genuinely funny man. One notable departure after promotion is a player by the name of Anthony Pulis, who, as you can guess, is the son of Tony Pulis, who had never really made the grade at Stoke. He was there before his dad. His dad didn't even give him like the, he's my kid, I'm going to give him an opportunity sort of run. He just bombed him out, loan, and then out you go to Southampton. But from what I've heard, Anthony Pulis is actually a fairly talented coach. He's largely worked in the United States, I believe. Anyway, first season up, Stoke City finished 12th. It's a really good return. Ricardo Fuller, once again, the top goal scorer. They're getting good crowds. They've got a really strong home support. Pulis is pissing on the chips of every single club in the league with, long grass and a tight pitch and just tremendous stuff. Turning off the radiators in the away dressing room and all sorts of stuff, or turning them up if need be. The next summer, they bring in Robert Huth for $5 million, Dean Whitehead for $5 million, Tunke for $5 million, Diego Arizmendi for $5 million, for $2.5 million, sorry. Danny Collins comes in and they sign Asmir Begovic in the January window. Olafinjana goes to Hull that year. They get their money back off him, but he obviously didn't make much of an impression. They also sold Carol Court. But the one notable thing is they're signing lots and lots of big lads. There's very few small fellas coming in the door. It's a lot of big, tasty fellas coming in to boot people up in the air. And just looking through this squad, Steve Simonson, he was a talented goalkeeper that never quite became what he was expected to be. Andy Griffin, who I believe started out with Stoke, had gone to Newcastle and had found his way back to Stoke after spells at Portsmouth and Derby. He was in this squad, but rarely featured. But he was a good player in his day. Danny Higginbottom, they signed him. Robert Huth. Glenn Whelan, Liam Lawrence, James Beattie was there, another big lump of a striker. You know, like all the strikers, all the centre-backs, they're generally all massive individuals because that's what he wanted. He wanted the biggest possible team. He wanted to be really physical, really aggressive, and just overwhelm you. And when you hear people talk about how they trained and how boring and repetitive the training was, but how they could appreciate it, because all they did was work on shape and set piece defending. And the only real attacking work they do was set pieces. So they knew wherever the ball was on the pitch, they always knew where they were meant to be, and they would adjust their shape according to where the ball was meant to be on the pitch. Because that was Pulis, boiling football down to its very, very purest form and just working from there. And a lot of people would view him as a dinosaur. A lot of people don't like the style of play. A lot of people don't like how brash he can be. A lot of people don't like how aggressive his teams are. But ultimately, Tony Pulis had a way that he viewed the game and a way that he saw his team could overcome the talent disparity, the financial disparity, and be a solid Premier League team. And like they finish 11th in year 2. Now, I will say, he did always bang the drum about the financial disparity. But as we're seeing here, Stoke spent quite a bit of money under Pulis. It wasn't like a thing they were up working on shoestrings. Peter Coates and the Coates family pumped quite a lot of money in. And Pulis spent a lot of it badly, especially in those early seasons. Now, of course, not many people wanted to go and play for them. They weren't an attractive club to play for. Stoke is not viewed as an attractive place to go and live. And a lot of people just didn't want to be part of the agricultural take on the game that Pulis had. But, it worked for them. Season 3, they finished 13th, 46 points. They bring in Jermaine Pennant. They bring in Kenwyne Jones for $8 million. John Walters arrives from Ipswich, would become a bit of a legend at the place. Eidur Gudjohnsen comes in. Had obviously been at Chelsea. He'd been at Barca. He'd been at Monaco. He'd been on loan at Spurs. So just think of that, right? You're living in London, Barcelona, Monaco, London again, and then you move to Stoke. Now, luckily for him, he's from Iceland. So, no disrespect, but it's a bit out of the way. Sure, it's a lovely place. And I'm sure Reykjavik is as good as everybody says it is. But it's a bit out of the way. A little bit like Stoke. We start to see some of the players that they bought in that hadn't worked out start to get sold off. Andy Fay, James Beattie, Tunkay. Pennant comes in. John Carew comes in. John Carew, another small striker. Season 4, 11-12. They finished 14th. 45 points. He, like Roy Hodgson, had an algorithm and he knew how to get the amount of points he needed. They bring in Jonathan Woodgate, Matty Upson, Wilson Palacios, who was actually a very underrated player. Cameron Jerome comes in, another powerful, bustly striker. And Peter Crouch arrives for $10 million, the biggest signing to date. Now, not powerful, but certainly big. Abdoulaye Faye leaves, Ibrahim Sonko leaves, Gudjonsson's out the gap. But there's a lot of regret, I think, for how they spent some of that early money. Arizmendi, he went on loan a few times, just couldn't cope with the style. I do think there was part of Pulis that thought, we'll establish ourselves playing this way and then we'll soften it, we'll become more of a footballing team. And when it didn't really work out for him and the players he was bringing in with the view on that, he just thought, we'll just stick to what we do. 2012-13, once again, it's a 12th place finish. Once again, it's mid-40s points. This summer, he goes wildly American. Jeff Cameron comes in, 2.5 million. Morris Edu comes in, I think it was about 2 million. Breck Shea, who should have been really good, comes in the January. They also signed Charlie Adam from Liverpool. Stephen Nzonzi, who was hugely underrated. Hugely underrated. He was a very good defensive midfielder. And in the January, they get Jack Butland, who's the most highly regarded young goalkeeper in the country. Woodgate didn't work out. He got bombed out. Ricardo Fuller finally left. Higginbottom left. Michael Tong left. They loaned out Pennant and Sidibe and Delap. And Rory Delap had been so important for them with those long throws. Like, those long throws were their pre-planned free kick. Some teams have corner routines and free kick routines. They had throw-ins. That long, flat throw from Rory Delap, where they would purposely leave gaps in the hoarding so that Rory Delap could get a long run up to launch balls into the box. And oftentimes, at half-time, when they were changing ends, you would see the ball boys pulling the hoardings down to create different gaps and take away the gaps that the opposition team might have taken advantage of. 13-14 then, Tony Pulis is gone. A decision was made that they'd stagnated, that they weren't going where the Coates family wanted them to go. And in what was quite a controversial move, they let Tony Pulis go. He'd taken them from an afterthought in the Championship into the Premier League. He'd gotten them as high in the Premier League as they were going to get at that time. And not only that, he'd done it while making them really relevant. Because when the season fixtures came out, everybody looked for, obviously, the big rivals, the big six, and Stoke. When do we play Stoke? It's always forgotten as well, he got them to Wembley. He got them to the FA Cup final. In 2011, Stoke City knocked out Cardiff in a replay, knocked out Wolves, knocked out Brighton, knocked out West Ham, absolutely demolished Bolton in a semi-final, and got to a final against Manchester City. And this was Manchester City when the money was starting to really have an impact. This was City who hadn't yet won anything. This was a City team with Joe Hart in goal, Micah Richards at right back, Vincent Kompany and Julian Lescott in the middle, and Alexander Kolarov at left back. Nigel de Jong and Gareth Barry as the double pivot, David Silva off the right, Yaya Toure as a 10, Mario Balotelli on the left, and Carlos Tevez through the middle. A bench of Shea Given, Pablo Zabaleta, Dedrick Boyata, James Milner, Adam Johnson, Patrick Vieira, and Edin Dzeko. That's a hell of a group of players. Stoke, on the other hand, lined up with Thomas Sorensen in goal. And Thomas Sorensen was, for many years, a very underrated Premier League goalkeeper. Played for Sunderland, played for Villa, played for Stoke. Spent 17 years in England, the majority of his career. Won the majority of his Danish caps playing for Premier League teams. A very, very good goalkeeper. Andy Wilkinson played at right back that day. He'd come through the Stoke Academy. He'd survived some loans. He'd established himself in the squad. He'd bought into everything Tony Pulis was selling. And while he wasn't an every game starter for them, he was always a reliable presence. And he was rewarded with a start in an FA Cup final And him and Balotelli had a proper good old battle. Ryan Shawcross played centre-back and was their captain that day. Many people only remember him for the leg breaker on Aaron Ramsey, but for the years he was there, he was very, very good for Stoke. Dominant in the air, aggressive, front-footed, and would automatically be a pick in any all-time Stoke 11. No question about that. Did bizarrely end his career playing for Inter Miami, which is one of the most contrasting things you can imagine. But what I always admired about him was when they went down, he stayed with them. He could have moved on. He had more than one opportunity to move on. He decided to stay with them. And I think there's quite a lot to be said for that. Next to him, you had Robert Huth. Chelsea had nabbed him as a 17-year-old, developed him. He'd gone to Middlesbrough. Stoke brought him in. Shawcross and Huth were horrible to play against. Absolutely horrible. But they were excellent together. They were super consistent. And obviously he'd go on and win a Premier League title with Leicester City. At left back, you had Mark Wilson, versatile Irish defender who could play anywhere in defence or midfield. He'd come through at Portsmouth, had a bunch of loans, went to Stoke, bought into what Pulis was selling, and was in the team every week under Tony Pulis, in one position or another. In midfield, Jermaine Pennant started on the right. In the double pivot, you had Glenn Whelan and Rory Delap. Two lads that'll run all day for you. And that's all he wanted them to do, run all day, close off space, win the ball, get it wide, get it forward. No central passing from Stoke. The defenders were tasked with hitting the strikers, not passing it to them, hitting them. Pump it long, let them win it in the air. The fullbacks were allowed to pass it to the wingers, but only if the wingers were in the opposition half. Only if they were in the opposition half. The midfielders were told to get it wide. And the wingers were Pennant, known for his crossing, and Matthew Etherington, known for his crossing. And up front, you had Kenwyne Jones, all 6'2" of them, big, powerful, quick, decent all-rounder, never lived up to the talent he had, but decent player. And John Walters, 6 foot, about 6 foot wide, only knew how to play one way, was super aggressive about it, would not be tamed. Carlo Nash on the bench as the backup goalkeeper, Danny Collins and Abdoulaye Faye as backup centre-backs, both of them enormous. Danny Pugh is sort of the backup wide player. Salif Diao is the backup, go on and kick people midfielder. Dean Whitehead, another go on and kick people type of player, but he could play a couple of positions. And the backup striker on the day, John Carew, 6'5", massive. And they ended the game with him, Kenwyne Jones and John Walters up front together, trying to pump balls in on top of them. Yaya Toure scored the only goal of the game in the 74th minute, and City won the cup. But Tony Pulis got Stoke to the FA Cup final. It was his second spell there. He began his managerial career at Bournemouth, where he'd finished his playing career. He went to Gillingham, he went to Bristol City, went to Portsmouth, didn't go great. Went to Stoke. I believe the first time he was at Stoke, he was a joint manager. I just want to confirm that. I'm almost certain he was a joint manager in his first spell. 1 second now. Right about that. I could be wrong about that. He was. He was a joint manager with Dave Kevin. But then he very quickly became the only manager. And they were a mid-table championship team, and he kept them as a mid-table championship team. He went away. He worked at Plymouth. He came back. And he had amazing success for what that club had been. Absolutely amazing success for what that club had been. And the funny thing is, when he was there the first time, Stoke had a board of Icelandic directors who sacked him for not being ambitious enough in the transfer market. Then when he came back, they were gone. The Coates family had come in. And he was overly ambitious in the transfer market with some of the signings he brought in, most of whom didn't work out. It was when he stuck to the domestic signings, the big fellas. That's when it worked for him. And you wouldn't go back and watch their games for love of the game. But there's just this charming thing for me about Stoke and their adventure in the Premier League, where they came up, they were unapologetically themselves. They didn't try to be anything else. They might have had ideas that they would become something else, but ultimately they were just themselves the whole time. Now, Mark Hughes did quite well there, it must be said. In his first season, he finished 9th. In his second season, he finished 9th. And in his third season, he finished 9th. And each time he got 50 plus points. Because he built on what Pulis had left behind. Then they finished in 13th. And the following season, they were relegated. Hughes was sacked in January. Paul Lambert came in. It was a disaster. Lambert was sacked. Gary Rowett came in. He got sacked in the January. Nathan Jones came in. He was doing really well with Luton. He was hired. It was a disaster. He was sacked by the November. Michael O'Neill came in. He'd been the Northern Ireland manager. And frankly, since they got relegated, they've just been a bottom half or mid-table championship team. Like, there hasn't been a season since they've gone down where you've really looked at them and thought, this is going to be the year Stoke come back up. 16th, 15th, 14th, 14th, 16th, and 17th. So they've never even finished in the top half in the Premier League, in the Championship, since being relegated at the end of 17-18. But like, they had some fun players. Mark Hughes brought in some really fun players during his time there. You know, he brought in Mark Muniesa, who's a good player. Marco Arnautovic. Stephen Ireland came in as well. Peter Odemwingie came in a part exchange for Kenwyn Jones. He brought in Bojan, who was really good to begin with. He brought in Xherdan Shaqiri, who was a ton of fun and really didn't look like he belonged there. Joselu, just this past season, won the Champions League with Real Madrid. He was at Stoke. You know? Ibrahim Afella, who, when he was young at PSV, looked like he was going to be a star, went to Barca, didn't work out, went from Barca to Stoke. Because Bojan had done it. And Bojan told him to do it. Gianelli Mbula was signed as well, and he's the player I always liked, but just didn't work at all. Didn't work at all for him there. He'd been brilliant for Marseille. He'd gone to Porto. I think he was only at Porto for 6 months, and Stoke paid like 18 million for him, and it was just a mess. An absolute mess. But they had, like I said, Marco van Ginkel was there as well. He was a decent player. He just had horrible luck with injuries. You start Joe Allen, he was there for a long time, even after they went down. Cedro Barahino was probably the worst signing they made in the entire time they were in the Premier League. They paid 12 million for him. He was with them for 2 years. They paid up his contract and told him to go away. And like, Harry Souther was there, and he was there up until recently. Nathan Collins has been there. There's been a lot of good players have come in. A lot of good players went through there. Bruno Martins Indy was there. Wilfred Bonney was there for a time. Didn't really work out, but he was there. I think Darren Fletcher on a free. Buda Njai, 14 million didn't work. Kevin Wimmer, 18 million didn't work. Eric Choupo-Moting was there. That guy also has, if I'm not mistaken, he doesn't have a Champions League because he joined the year after. He's a Champions League runners-up medal with PSG against Bayern, and then he joined Bayern. But he went from Stoke, where, by the way, he was not good. He spent 1 year, played 32 games, scored 5 goals, got relegated, signed for Paris Saint-Germain, won 2 league titles as a squad player, admittedly. Then he went to Bayern and proceeded to win 3 league titles. 2 as a squad player, 1 as a bit more than a squad player because Lewandowski left. But, you know, he's much better for both clubs than he ever was for Stoke. Pulis obviously would go on to manage Crystal Palace. He'd manage West Brom. He'd manage Middlesbrough. He briefly managed Sheffield Wednesday. It never really felt like his heart was in any of it after Stoke. He's gone from Stoke 11 years now. He was 55 when he left. He's been out of the game since he's 62, so he lasted 7 years. He was managing 21 years, including his time with Stoke. Both times with Stoke. After he left Stoke, I never felt like his heart was fully in it. Because Stoke was a club that he had kind of sculpted and shaped. Fantastic stuff, though. Really was. Really, really was. Right, that's it for today. I've gone very long. I will be back in a bit with the 2-footed extra, which will be news and gossip. So I'll speak to you later. Bye-bye.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.